Good morning. Good to be with y'all. First, I want to put a shout out and thanks to the Harrisons. As you may notice, I'm in the Harrison studio at the moment, and I appreciate all of the efforts that have been ongoing while we've been attempting to connect with each other during these odd times for us. I know this has put them out in many ways, and we're appreciative of their willingness to continue ongoing as we strive to continue worshiping together. It's been stated by several already in this particular format. This is an odd perspective for even the speakers. Usually we're out looking at least over you. Now we're kind of looking at ourselves. For me, it's perhaps even a little more tenuous. I'm tethered, which is an uncomfortable position for me. I like to be able to move around. And it helps me to keep focused and hopefully helps to keep you awake as well. Unfortunately, that's not an option. So you're on your own today. We'll try to keep this as concise as possible as we continue throughout this lesson. I'd also like to take a few moments just to kind of factor where we are. I know how the rest of you are perceiving this year itself, but at this particular juncture right now, we're about halfway through the year again, which also means we're about halfway through the series of lessons that we've put forth with the idea of becoming image bearers. We'd like to have some input from you all as to how we're doing as we continue. I know Andy just put out another email projecting what's going to be covered in the next few months. But your perspective on how we've been doing, I think personally, and obviously with a bias from the slant that I have, that we've been doing a pretty good job. Appreciate the lessons put forth by many, by all, and as we continue, it is our prayer and our desire that we indeed all can learn much and better become better servants and better image bearers as we continue moving forward. So again, don't hesitate to send us some feedback, things we might improve. Appreciate things that we've already done as we continue this focus as well. And ultimately, let's remain our focus is, despite all these oddities, if you will, of this particular situation and time, God is indeed in control and always has been, and will continue to be. So if we can keep that in our focus and our attitude should be greatly adjusted and easily controlled. I want to thank Andrew in particular for his lead-in, unity of the family, being the broader concept of the congregation, the church. Actually, all the concepts he covered would indeed tie in directly with the idea of the family unit itself. But even before we get there, I'd like us all to perhaps step back and review ourselves. We got several things going on right now. We have obviously the COVID situation. We have the racial tensions that are going on, and a host of other things. We could go down a list of things to remind us of the challenges before us. First, I'd like us to remember, as we take advantage of opportunities such as this, or whatever other media you may be using, to remember what you say and who you represent. It's easy, as I've been told, as most of you know, I don't use some of the other venues. I've heard of them. I am not completely a technophobe. I'm not a technophobe at all. I just choose not to engage in the idea of using Facebook and some of the other things. It's just not something that I find beneficial. The one-to-one contact, as you all should know by now, is what I prefer. It's much more effective in being able to determine how things are being received and hopefully in how things are being intended. And we can make those adjustments as necessary. It seems from what I'm hearing from many other individuals, that oftentimes when you get on these other sources, these other media outlets, that perhaps we're less controlled, less mindful of how our words and actions are going to affect others. We are in no way, shape, or form devoid of responsibility with whatever we say or do on those other sites as well. In fact, you might even consider that you're being more tethered, if you will, to whatever comments you're making. Because again, what you say, what you write in those situations is all the people see. And their own bias kicks in there as well. So you may be being assigned something that is totally foreign to what you're actually trying to say, but the way you've couched it and ensconced it is a way that is being drawn by others. So let's step back. Be cautious whenever we are using our words. There's a proverb that is often used, the idea that we are a soft answer turns away wrath. And I'm afraid sometimes we use that improperly. It's not necessarily the volume that we use in our face-to-face or in our other communications. It could be the tone, and it could be, again, the actual words that are being used. It is very possible for me to speak softly and still cut you deeply. And for words that I may not intend to cut, to still carry forth that very definite problem. So again, as we communicate one with another, whatever venue you are using, let's make sure we're doing so with the insight and a grain of salt, and recognizing again that however we say to whomever we're talking to, it's going to be taken not necessarily the way we intend, but even if it is, let's make sure our intent is indeed in tune with what God would have us to be. So with that being said, let's dive into the direct parallels of what we're talking about today as far as with the family itself. This passage may not seem in accord, but I'd like to look at Proverbs, the 20th proverb, verses 10 through 13. And the writer there says, diverse weights and diverse measures, they are both alike, an abomination to the Lord. Even a child is known by his deeds, whether what he does is pure and right. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. You may be scratching your head trying to think, well, what does that have to do with anything as far as dealing with family situations? I would suggest that this particular verse is very much like what Christ is talking about in Matthew 7th chapter, right there toward the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where he's reminding us, starting in verse 1 of the 7th, where the idea again of judging is addressed. And what he's saying in that context, as you continue throughout that passage in the 7th chapter, is the idea that however we measure, however we are trying to put forth on others, we need to take heed that we recognize that whatever standards we're using are going to be administered to us as well. So in that context, we want to make sure that the measurements being used are true, just measurements. Again, this has been stressed throughout this series and through the study we're doing in the class with the peacemakers. If we can get our head around the fact that everything we say and do is to be in accordance with how we treat others the way we ourselves want to be treated, if we can truly engage ourselves and adjust that attitude and really ingrain it into ourselves, imagine how much more effective we'll be in administering conversation to others, in moving forward with others, in what other venue we may be. Now, specifically today, we're going to be talking about the idea of the family and unity there. And I would suggest that, again, oftentimes what we tend to do is we couch ourselves in the best possible terms. Oftentimes we even refer to this particular subject as we look out hopefully in our own family, and we're amongst believers or those moving toward that direction. If that is the case, and thankfully in many situations it is, are our actions in harmony? Are we truly demonstrating in all that interaction the ability and the desire to emulate our God and our Savior? Are we communicating with each other in a way that is loving? Are we assuming the best in every situation? I think if we evaluate ourselves truly, we'll find ourselves all lacking somewhere in that equation. But I think perhaps it might better serve us in this particular setting at this time to be aware of, and indeed in most of our situations, we're not all surrounded by believers or those moving in that direction to begin with. Many or most of us have a family member or members that are not in any way, shape, or form perceiving or proclaiming to be serving God. And in some cases, maybe even opposed in such a way that it is directly attacking your position. It's not a comfortable position, but it's one that we have to recognize is there. What can we do as individuals in our given situation? And all these concepts actually will be the same, whether we're dealing with those that are striving to follow God, or whether we're dealing with those that aren't recognizing God at all. Again, it's a comment was made in class by Wendy today. The only individual, the only situation we can truly control in any given time is ourselves and how we are reacting. Again, another passage that we often refer to in dealing with situations, go back to Peter. Pardon me. And we're reminded there in 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, of a situation where, in particular, again, is singling out the wife in that particular setting. But the words are appropriate for all of us. Well, again, let's not quibble over all the details, but the basic concept: wives likewise be submissive to your husbands, your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. When they observe your chaste conduct, accompanied by fear, do not let, again, this is where you can start trying to nitpick and say, obviously, there are differences in our situation from man to a woman or from a parent to a child. But the base comment here is that you influence others by your actions, by your conduct. Again, if we look at book of Proverbs and throughout Scripture, knowledge is something that is often touted that we need to gain. But with that knowledge, if it's not controlled by wisdom, it becomes rather vain and useless. That wisdom is an actual putting in practice, using that information, if you will, in a way that is conducive to others and adjusting our attitudes as well. So again, oftentimes we hear the phrase, things are not taught, but they're caught. It's the same concept. And actually, most effectively, things are best emulated when they're both caught and taught. So as we as individuals in our family situation, if we're behaving in a way that is conducive to removing stress, to removing obstacles, it's going to affect those that we're around. Again, it may take a while, but ultimately, again, we are in control only of ourselves. The time will come when we're dealing with individuals where they will evaluate their own actions. What can we do to help push them in a direction that will be beneficial, that will help them to, again, at some point, acknowledge God and His sovereignty? That will be our ultimate goal. But until they are willing, until they are ready, you can go back to the Sermon on the Mount itself. In Christ's words, they have to be seeking, they have to be willing, they have to be knocking on the door in order for whatever message is being delivered for them to receive. What we can do in all our actions and in all our endeavors at all times is to be ready. Part of that being ready is demonstrating and keeping ourselves in control at all times. I would suggest, and I want to commend the speakers throughout this series. But in particular, I want to commend you because you started using James a lot. And that's always a good thing from my perspective. So let's look again in the book of James, the first chapter itself, and remind ourselves of where we need to be at all times. Part of what James talks about here is the idea if we're lacking wisdom in verse 5, to ask of God. But we need to ask in a way that demonstrates we are confident that He will answer. We have no doubt that He is capable and that He has whatever answers that we need. So if we maintain that attitude, we will be adjusted into and molded into the image He would have us to be, and we'll become effective. It's when we allow our self-doubt to creep in, or when we allow circumstances to influence us unduly, that we start behaving in ways that are not going to be conducive and lead to a desired effect. And I would also suggest in our interaction with each other, what is really the source of conflict? Oftentimes, what we want to do is we want to point the finger at someone else. Again, it's been illustrated and talked about recently. Whenever you point the finger at someone, you have several pointing back at you. That's where we tend to fall down, not acknowledging our own situations. Again, here in James, let's be reminded of where's all this conflict comes from to begin with, all this sin comes from to begin with, is in which we allow each of us to be tempted and drawn away by our own desires. And when that desire is conceived, sin then comes forth. That is the root of the problem. And if we can step back and get a real view on our given conflict, our contention, most often we're going to find out it started with us. It may start with an unjust viewpoint or an unjust desire. Again, it's covered in class today, and Andrew himself made the comment. We want mercy for ourselves. We want judgment for others. If we have that attitude, we're already started out on the wrong foot. We need to have mercy toward others and be thankful for the mercy that's been shown toward us. We do need to evaluate situations, and I'm not suggesting that in any given situation in a family, that whenever an issue is brought up, that it's an unjust measurement by any stretch. Again, I'm going to suggest that all of us have been children at some point. I think it's a pretty safe statement. But we shouldn't all be children continuously. And if you reflect back on your given situation, or perhaps in your family situation now, how often are we confronted with things such as, you're not being fair. You're treating brother, sister in a different fashion than you are. You're always on their side. You don't ever take my position. And again, in the heat of the moment, that's where we all think we are. But if we can actually step back and look at it, it seldom is an accurate description of any situation. Again, our kids got tired of hearing things such as, what did you do? When they came to us with a conflict, it was, whatever. My sister did this to me. Okay. What did you do to provoke the situation to begin with? Well, usually you don't want to direct. What did you do to provoke or to bring on that situation? And it's easy for us to kind of sit back and chuckle at that in the child relationship. But let's look at ourselves. How often is that conflict in and of itself brought on by something we did or that we perceive someone else did? Again, it's been brought up in class repeatedly, and again today as well. If we're going to assume anything at any given time, we need to assume the best. And again, I'm afraid that most of us fall into that category that is seldom the way we go. We assume the worst. We assume, even in contact with one another, if I'm conversing with someone, I come into that situation with a preconceived notion. And I'm not going to be dissuaded from that, because I know I've made the right decision. Again, let's be honest with ourselves. Oftentimes we have not, because we do not know what was being brought on by the other person or what situation they have themselves. And oftentimes, again, as I've used this illustration several times before, when I approach someone about a given situation, I oftentimes have drawn the conclusion that there's a problem. And in particular, that you have a problem with something I've said, done, or am doing, or whatever. And I'll approach you. And I'll get a kind of a sidelong look as, I don't have any idea what you've been talking about. And come to find out that perhaps it was something as simple as their dog had died that day. And when they happened to be thinking about that situation when our paths crossed, it had nothing to do with me. The point is, oftentimes we make every situation about us, about me. And that in itself brings forth conflict. It's not about me. It's about you and about us serving God. So as we continue to strive to move forward, we need to constantly be looking toward what can we do best in a family situation. First off, I need to really understand where they're coming from. And again, if it's dealing with a family member that's not in any way claiming to be trying to serve God, are they responding to me because I've got a haughty attitude, I'm better than you, holier than thou attitude, or at least their perception? And I need to step back and evaluate. What have I done to cause you to think that? And again, it's not always justified, but that's their position or their perspective. And I need to try to address that. It might be as simple as, how can I change my behavior? How can I approach you in such a way that doesn't raise your hackles? Oftentimes that's not going to be immediately well received as well. Take some time, step back. We don't have to continually push through. Be willing to allow them to have time to evaluate, as well as for us to step back and evaluate. And again, our inclination in any situation is not to want to admit that we don't know. We're asked a question or we're dealt with a situation we don't know how to handle. And we continue to push forward anyway, whether it be out of pride, or whatever motivation it may be. Don't be afraid to step back. Don't be afraid to say, I'm not sure. I don't know how to deal with this. I'll need to think about this situation. I'll need to ask for some others' input on this situation. Seek out some wise counsel as to how I might approach and how I might be more effective in dealing with the situation in a way that, again, will be conducive to the outcome that we want, which is for us to move both closer to a godly relationship. As we continue on even through this first chapter of James, the root of the problem, James helps us identify in verses 13 through 15, but again, being generally, it's something within ourselves. But as he continues throughout 16 through 22, he helps us identify how we can resolve the situation. If we can continually remember that God is in control, that the righteousness of God is there, that we can lay aside, if you will, in verse 21, lay aside all filthiness, all overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word and not hearers only. And that is where the rubber really always meets the road. Are we truly in allowing ourselves to be influenced in a way that we emulate everything that God would have us to be? It's a constant struggle. And if we look at our family conflicts in and of themselves, what does that conflict promote? How does it help this family situation? And in general, the answer is always simply, it doesn't. What we do is we fall into that attack mode, if you will, oftentimes, or we fall into the it's your fault mode. That's not going to resolve any conflict. In fact, the Galatians, when Paul was writing to them, reminded them, you're biting and devouring each other. Again, that context there is broader, but it is applicable in a family situation. When we deal with one another, are we speaking in a way that we would want to be spoken to? Are we identifying with the situation in a way that we want others to use the same judgment toward us, the same weight and measures that we've applied? Or are we in somehow, some way, trying to justify our position in our inaction or our actions in a way that are not in compliance? Again, we've been in situations many times where we're asked questions such as, what information can you give me? What template can you give me to cause whoever it is I'm in conflict with to change? They're the problem. Oftentimes, that's not really a fair evaluation. Oftentimes, I'm the problem, and I really want them to adjust themselves to support me. Now, again, I'm not suggesting in every situation that that is the case. There are genuinely times when we have to address in a family situation a true problem, a situation. But even in those situations, are we doing so in a way that is conducive and will compel them to lean toward God? Or are we causing them to raise up their defenses and their hackles? that won't be in any way, shape, or form moving toward a solution that will help the family gain that peace as well. And even in this series that we're going through in class right now, it is called Peacemakers. And I'm afraid sometimes we get set in our minds that we're peacekeepers, the idea that the peace is already there. Very title, and again, going back to the Matthew 5 Excel. In order to be a peacemaker, you have to be willing to recognize the situation is not where it needs to be to begin with. And it's going to take direct action from us and an outside source to bring that situation into a peaceful status. What are we willing to do? How are we willing to do it? If we could take the Matthew 5, 3 through 16, the Beatitudes that are often referred to, if we can embody those, we can truly put them into our own lives, then conflict resolution is going to be a piece of cake. Conflict itself is going to be resolve is going to go down to begin with dramatically. And as we continue to move forward in our own family situation, how can I evaluate a given situation? Conflict comes up. What am I doing? How am I unifying the family? Again, let's make sure we understand what that word itself means. Unity is not uniformity. I'm going to go out on a very short limb here and suggest that any and all of us in a family situation, we look at any other individual, they're somehow different. Their views somehow are not always in accordance with ours, nor do they need to be. There are some things in a family we have to agree on. We have to have certain goals. We have to have certain direction that we're intended on. But getting there are sometimes different paths to that solution. And there are other things that we just don't have to have an opinion on. We can have, rephrase it, we will always have an opinion, but I don't have to have an opinion on your opinion. Just because your opinion doesn't happen to be in harmony with mine does not necessarily mean it's inherently wrong. There are strengths in those. Again, go back to the Proverbs itself. When it talks about the idea of a friend and iron sharpening iron, that is not the suggestion that agreement is sharpening agreement. It's the idea that those differing views, those differing perspectives allows us to draw closer as we hone that edge of that knife, if you will, on that whetstone. We're allowing that friction, that obstruction itself to mold that knife edge into a true cutting edge. Same thing is true with us. Whether it be in a family situation, or in the broader family situation of the church itself, we are allowing those influences to mold us into that image, or at least we can allow those images if we will merely back off and allow them to have that true intent. In class today, 2 Timothy was brought up. Excuse me. Second chapter, 2 Timothy. Again, in the context there, the idea of dealing with false teachers is the main focus. But the words being described there will and can be used in any of our conflict resolution. And again, I realize I haven't used the word unity a lot when we're talking about unity of the family. Getting that unity of the family is resolving these conflict issues. It's the idea of we're behind. But as Timothy is writing there, he gets down to the 23rd verse, and he reminds us to avoid foolish and ignorant disputes, knowing that they generate strife. And a servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but must be gentle to all, able to teach, patient in humility, correcting those who are in opposition. God perhaps will grant them repentance so that they may know the truth. And if we are pursuing unity in our family, how we do it is the most critical element. If we're allowing ourselves to be distracted by the words distracted or described here with disputes, with ignorant disputes, foolishness, then obviously we're not moving in the direction God would have us to move. And we're being distracted from that. Again, I'm reminded in this particular time frame, I've often heard of this COVID situation. We're fighting an unseen enemy. And indeed, it should be kind of a duh statement. Most of us, I don't think any of us have the vision to be able to see a virus. I forget what you actually told me, 0.004 micro. Okay. Most of us can't even perceive of that. So, by the way, if you're wondering where I'm getting my information, that was from Andy on the sideline here, provided me with the size of a virus. You're not going to see that with a naked eye. So for the statement to be made, we're fighting an unseen enemy, is kind of a duh statement. But I'd like to broaden that out a little bit for us. Whether we're facing COVID, whether we're facing the racism idea, whether we're facing any given conflict, what we tend to do is focus on the wrong element. All these conflicts come from a common source. Some of them may be, again, us desiring our lust, our own desires, and our own self-promotion. But that still is motivated by the idea of Satan and the father of all lies. If we can allow ourselves to step back in any given situation and truly evaluate the enemy, evaluate where it's coming from, and not allow ourselves to be drawn into these ideas of foolish disputes and behavior that is inconsistent with what God would have us to be, then we can be the proponents that we're intended to be. Then we can serve God in every avenue of our lives in the way it's intended to be. And first and foremost, most importantly, in our family. That's where we have the most potential to be the most influential and thereby allow that influence also to spread out to others as we fortify one another, as we prepare one another in a way that we are unified in our direction. And I would suggest, again, most of us have been in situations where we tend to, as a family situation, we may tend to nitpick at one another. We tend to tease one another, or what we say is teasing with one another. And that's all fun and games, well and good, some would say. But as soon as an outside source attacks, whether it be even with the same words that perhaps we were using, usually as a family, we coalesce and we push back against that outside attacking force. Why is that? Are we not recognizing that that attack is truly not beneficial? And if we can recognize that from that outside source, shouldn't we be recognizing from the inside source? If we can draw on that conclusion, if we're willing to stand up, again, I know everyone hasn't had siblings. There are some single children out there, but there are others that have. And oftentimes that's where you kind of see this mentality kick in, where perhaps you're picking on one another and then that outside source comes in and joins in oftentimes, and the pushback changes. Now that you're attacking my family, now it's different. Well, I'm suggesting that it shouldn't be different. We should not attack our family as well. And if we can get our mind, again, around that very concept that's promoted throughout Scripture, love your enemy, treat others as you would have yourself to be treated, that will enable us to live our lives in a way and become that example that we need to be. Then we will be unified as a family, individually. As we come closer to God, we will influence those around us. Incrementally, we'll draw them in as well, or at least we'll provide them with the opportunity. Again, as brought out in 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, our conduct is what's going to influence others within and without. So what are we doing as we push forward? What are we doing as we continue to strive through this life? To draw closer to God ourselves, to be that example that we are to be, to recognize the flaws within ourselves, to address them, to allow God to work in us, to remove those obstacles from our own lives so that we in turn can help others see and remove those obstacles in their own lives. I'm going to leave this message with you at this time and pray that as we continue to move forward, that we can center ourselves in such a way as truly to be image bearers of God, everything we say and do, in whatever venue, whatever media we might be using. Thank you.